Great. Okay, so we're going to go backwards a little bit. We talked about integrated assessment models last time, which is, I would kind of say, at this sort of higher level. And we're coming back down to these smaller sort of systems models, which are mainly focused. We're going to be talking about two particular systems models today, focused on the energy system as opposed to being totally integrated with the climate and environment side of of modeling, which we saw in the IANs. So we had discussed a whole set of different types of models, right, in the bottom up and top down. And so we're going to be focusing specifically on a subset of those approaches, looking at bottom-up optimization, but also the popular models that we're talking about today are also kind of partial equilibrium in some respects. So there's some overlap with these things. So I had talked a little bit about this before, about how you would sort of approach scoping in energy systems models. And actually, I stumbled on this figure, which I think does a really nice job of kind of structuring how you would approach this sort of scoping idea. And this was actually put together by that guy that I was telling you about, who made the Open Energy Outlook, the sort of open source version of NEMS, and is now currently the administrator for EIA. So formulate your research question. Yeah, this is maybe somewhat overlooked when we're thinking about energy systems models, but it's probably one of the most important things to think about, right? The contextualization of your model. When we think about model outputs, and we've looked at this before, right, where we do these retrospective examinations, and you're like, oh, these models did terribly compared to what actually happened, right? But they were hopefully seeking to answer a particular research question, and so a lot of the usefulness may be less related to its ability to predict the future as opposed to sort of answering a particular research question. So always keep that in mind. Set your spatial temporal boundaries. That can have really big implications on even how you initially build the model, right? Because if you're talking about doing like a 1 year sort of high resolution forecast versus if you're doing like 20 years into the future, you can imagine the resolution of things that you're looking at, the detail and the like inputs of your data are going to be pretty different between those two types of models. Consider your model features. What are you going to include in here? Where are you really honing in on? So if you're doing some sort of like generic diffusion of technology curves, right, where you just have some simple parameters to show how a technology gets adopted, that might look really different than if you really wanted to dive into detail and you included like a consumer choice model so that you understand like what factors of a technology is going to get people to adopt it. So then goes into actually doing the analysis, and then after that, always important to include uncertainty and sensitivity, doing different types of scenarios, right? This is inherently a fairly uncertain area to be doing analysis. So you want to be able to capture that in some way, and then sort of communicating insights. And that last bit is kind of where we'll focus the next couple lectures, thinking about, for example, policies that leverage energy systems models. Yes. Yeah, so this is kind of like how you decide to structure investments and payoffs in your model. So like, are you going to do it all at once? Are you going to like amortize it in certain ways? How do you treat the ways that different like entities in your model consider like discounting and payback and that sort of thing? Um, yeah, so lumpy investment can be an artifact of like if you run your model in like 5-year time period increments, um, where you would traditionally be doing some kind of like annualized payback, like maybe you have to modify that a little bit because you're not working in these like 1-year time spans.
So could an example be retrofit? So if you're looking at either you can do a once and for all complete retrofit of a facility, or you do a partial one over time, so that you don't spend all that capital all at once. Is that an example of how you deal with investments models,
Um, no, well, I think for something like a retrofit, you would almost treat that kind of like a as like a overnight capital cost type of thing where because otherwise, so I'm thinking specifically about like a retrofit to like a power plant,
Yeah.
right? Then otherwise in the interim, like what's happening with the power plant, like is it operational, is it not operational? I don't think it's quite like that. So what I'm talking about more is um if we were to um if you were to do like some kind of payment structure, right, where you have year one, year two, year three, year four, year five, and then you have payments that are supposed to happen like this, right? So this would be, X dollars, let's say at a 10% discount. Then if your model only operated in 5-year increments and you have year one and then year six, you might do like an MPV of this to here, or um, or it gets all paid in at the end, right? Uh, so the the scaling of how your time works in your model is gonna kind of putts with the traditional way we calculate how these investments are made or how costs are paid. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So I had briefly talked about the Markell model um, during our overview of bottom-up models. This is was one of the more common energy systems models um, way back. Let's see, almost over 2 decades ago. Yeah. So this was first started in the 80s, originally created by ETSAP, which is the Energy Technology System Analysis Program of the IEA. And they were one of the first sort of institutions to really create a sort of systematic modeling framework for the sort of broad energy sector. So Markel stands for Market and Allocation Model. And before I kind of dive into the details of Markel, I thought it might be useful if we together as a class try and think about in an optimization context, how would we go about building an energy system model. So let's do that. So where do we start? Yes.
First principles, you have to have an objective function.
Great. Perfect. And so what objective might that be? Yeah. Okay. So I don't know. What would you be interested in? Sorry, I heard a bunch of things all at once. Yes.
Max or minimize the cost per megawatt hour with some minimum amount of like power need.
Okay.
So KISO model.
Okay. Yeah. And let's think a little bit beyond just electricity. So let's minimize so let's say the sum of things that provide us like energy services, right? And so we would want to, so on the electricity side, we're talking about like power plants that provide electricity, right? So that might be, so X like technology, and then each technology might have a cost associated with it, right? So tech cost. And each technology might be indicated by a subset I. So to review my notation again, I denote X's as decision variables, C as parameters, and then the subscripts, so in this case would be I, would indicate like sets of whatever this variable is describing. And then the superscripts are just a descriptor. Okay, so the superscripts don't actually sort of mean anything. So for something like electricity, this might be how much like natural gas plants or how much um, wind power or solar power or nuclear is getting installed in the system, and each of those has some corresponding cost, right? And so, yeah.
How much do you mean megawatts or megawatt hours?
We'll say some generic unit, okay, as long as it works out. So the tech costs, so CI. So this could be, so I equals, yeah, so for power generation, this might be megawatts. So then CI equals nuclear would be in terms of dollars per megawatt. But what other technologies provide us some kind of end use service? So, sorry? Transportation. Great. Okay. So then I could be like types of fuel technologies for cars, for example, right? So you could have something like I equals like EVs, something like this. And this could be I think they do it like this. So VMT from EVs. Yeah. So this would be this would really just be miles. That's the like service that you get, right? And then there could be a cost associated with this. Okay. So you can imagine that like in this descriptor contains many, many things. It could be actually a huge summation of a broad range of technologies that go beyond just electricity to include transportation and so on. Yeah.
Would you need to include the transmission and distribution grid in this? Because you have the endpoints, right? But there's a gigantic middle.
Yeah. Yeah. So you
is that separate, or you build that in?
Yeah, you could. So I mean, we could include that here, but you could include that also as like a as a different thing. So X distribution.
Use transaction costs elsewhere.
Hang on. Transaction costs. So can you be more specific?
Yeah, like when you're taking coal, just energy. When you're taking coal and transforming it to electricity, there's a transaction cost involved.
Yeah. So this might be something like I want to say fuel costs, but there can be other things. So okay, we'll call it transaction costs. Sure.
Another part of the model, if you have sort of you have kind of a network with represented with arrows. Those arrows can have transactions associated with them.
What do you mean arrows?
I'm thinking of sort of a drawn out representation of your system.
I see. Yep. Okay.
And it's all going to the objective function, but does all your math kind of live in your objective or something that lives elsewhere?
Well, so this objective function, remember, is just thinking about costs, right? And so, yeah, so if this is all that there was, then how much would we build? How much would we use? Zero, actually negative infinity, right? Because we haven't even confined it to be greater than or equal to 0. So then besides that obvious one of, these have to be greater than or equal to 0, how would we actually make it so that you'd want to build stuff? Yeah, so what constraints might we build? Okay, but how do we know how much megawatts that we need? Yeah, demand, right? And so basically what you're saying is that something like the amount of transaction in K has to be greater than or equal to some amount of demand and use demand. Something like that, right? And this basically this could be a generic set of what comes after K? L. So this might be something like you have a total amount of like megawatt demand, you might have a total amount of like mile demand, right? So L end uses could be something like megawatts, miles, and so on and so forth.
So shouldn't that be tech instead of transaction?
So I was thinking that
are we saying transactions like the losses from the phenotype, right?
Yeah. So something like this where you would have this is like the capacity, and then this would be like how much you're actually generating, something like that.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
You're saying transactions generate actual generation.
Yeah.
Coming in the lines.
We're sketching ideas, not like actual. Yeah. So this might be if you could.
Yeah.
instead of saying tech. That might be more accurate to say like capacity.
Is the end-use demand value exogenous, or do we somehow determine within the model?
Yeah, so this can be exogenous or it can be endogenous, and we'll see how that kind of plays out in the modeling. Okay. So you guys can hopefully start to see the general framework for how this is kind of getting put together, right? So just thinking about in the context of an optimization, like what your actual like objective function would be, what levers you have to play with in terms of your decision variables, and then how your constraints are organized kind of in a rough sense to be able to actually get you to, you know, build stuff or um, generate miles or electricity. Yes, yeah.
Like a cost of carbon, would you want to build that in as a constraint or as a cost?
Yeah. So what do you think?
I think it kind of depends on what regulation you have in place.
Okay. So if we were talking about a carbon tax or a carbon price, where do you think we would put that?
I kind of say if there were already a carbon tax in place, you'd put it in the objective function. But if not, if you're trying to limit yourself to a certain ppm, then you would put it in.
Yeah, exactly. So for a carbon price, basically you could do an additional thing here where this might get multiplied against a CO2 price. And then if it was a cap, then you could have something like, well, actually this should, all right, let's do this properly. This should be, it would be plus xk. There'd be a CO2 factor, so emissions factor, and then a price, CO2 dollar. So it'd be something like this. And then for a cap, you would have something like this, CK CO2 factor has to be less than or equal to your CO2 cap, something like that. Yeah. So this is actually an area that the model is really good at, right? It's the ability to put in like policy, either policy constraints or into the objective function to investigate how that might affect the system, right? And it's not necessarily the focus of all the sort of energy system models, but a lot of system models leverage the ability of that model to do this type of thing, to look at what happens as you enforce some kind of intervention into the system. Okay, any other questions about this? Okay. So here's the framework for Markell, gives you some kind of scoping in terms of how it's organized and what's going on here. So Markell itself is an optimization, much like the structure that we kind of just came up with. And it thinks about all of these different aspects of your energy system. The inputs are in orange, okay? So these essentially are your exogenous pieces going into the model. So we talked about the availability of technologies, right? So this would essentially be that I term from the last slide, what technologies you're allowing the model to sort of play around with. Demand for energy services. So this is helping determine that one constraint, right? How much that we need of any particular service. And then it's gonna figure out which technologies can sort of cost minimize to meet those demands and tell you what the deployment of those technologies are going to be. There are things like trade, so that it does include a little bit beyond the scoping of what we described in the last slide. And then the last thing is that once you have determined this and the sort of energy services being provided, you'd be able to calculate other pieces of that, right? So like energy consumption and then emissions and other ecological effects. Some versions of Markell do have like these feedback mechanisms where as I step forward in time, you can have things like climate affecting portions of your system. This isn't quite like in the same level of rigor as an integrated assessment model. They're not actually running like these complicated climate models. This might just be saying, oh, if you have some certain level of GHGs, that they have some way of figuring out what the like global warming potential is. It's very simplified in Markell, and we'll see it actually gets upgraded a little bit later in the next generation model. Okay. So the objective function. So this is essentially what we came up with in our little class exercise. So seeking to minimize total cost of the system, it's discounted over a planning horizon, right? So there are some nuances with how it's structured in that way. And you can see that essentially what they're minimizing, this MPV, is just a sum of all the costs. And there are many more sort of components of the cost that we didn't get necessarily into that much detail about, right? But from a conceptual standpoint, it's doing almost exactly what we were describing. So annual investments, fixed O&M, it has costs associated with imports and domestic resource production, and then revenue from exogenous energy and material exports, fuel and material delivery costs. You can also even do welfare losses if you change your demand a little bit. And so this ties a little bit into the earlier question of if demand is entirely exogenous, right? This actually allows you to kind of play around with that, yeah.
So that specifically the second one, the welfare loss.
Yeah.
So this is saying if for some reason there was a reduced end use demand, that is separately contrived and made up, say, like, you know, I guess how would you dictate how that is reduced and by how much, and like what's the rationale for reducing that, other than like, oh, the system breaks and therefore there's reliability issues.
So let's say you have a baseline scenario and I look around and I see everyone has some kind of demand for electricity, and so you have some target to hit that demand. Now what you can do in the system is actually to put, let's say, a utility associated with demand for that service. And now you can build like a elasticity. So essentially what happens is, let's say you have some strict climate goals, and so the price, so the cost of producing electricity might increase more and more, right? Because you're starting to deploy more expensive cleaner technologies, right? At a certain point, the willingness of your system to build really expensive stuff might be more than what people might be willing to pay for it, right? And so you have a loss in utility associated with a decrease in demand, but you're willing to take that rather than building up your supply
or loss in utility
of the people who want the end demand.
Well, what if, I mean, I could see like you put energy efficiency measures and that reduces demand, so that would show it as a welfare loss. Or
yeah, so
if like you're talking about transit or like an ICE vehicle, an electric vehicle, you compare that. But what if you do a single occupancy vehicle to a train, to a bus, right? Like because you're increasing the number of
yes.
yeah, but I wouldn't worry about that.
like you're increasing the number, you're changing the mode, and so you're reducing the amount of energy demanded per person because you've got efficient. So wouldn't that show that, oh, there is a welfare loss in this model because of efficiency improvements?
No. Yeah, because you're not talking about like a quantity of energy necessarily, as long as you satisfy the demand, right? And so
so this is more the cost is too high and then people stop.
Yeah.
Energy, and
so let me skip ahead actually. So we're talking about the demand curve right now, but let me hold off on that. So the supply curve hopefully is a little bit more intuitive, right? So the supply curve is like, who's heard of a marginal abatement curve? Yeah, so marginal abatement curve is kind of like, it's specifically thinking about emissions reduction, but the concept is basically, okay, you need some amount of energy, you can satisfy that up to a certain point, let's say until the resource is depleted, and then you go to the next technology, and that incrementally has a higher cost, right? And so this is essentially what the supply curve is building. It's in that sort of same vein, right? This is how supply curves work. The demand curve isn't necessarily like a traditional demand function. So it has own price elasticities. And essentially what happens is you have some willingness to sort of pay for some kind of energy service, right? And at a certain point, it gets too expensive, and then you essentially don't want to pay any more. And so that, right, supply and demand curve reaches some sort of equilibrium. And so you can actually calculate compared to a baseline. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're not constructing a real like demand curve based off a demand function. But essentially you have a baseline, and then as you move away from that baseline, if you are having like policies, or if you're in the future and the cost of energy production is higher, right? There's a trade-off between like paying more money or accepting some kind of welfare loss. So having that in the demand function, or sorry, in the objective function, allows you to not make that demand constraint like an entirely hard constraint. It becomes a piece of your cost instead.
So that I'm trying to how if it's part of the demand curve, it's not necessarily going to, like if you had a significant welfare loss, right? How would that reflect itself?
Yeah.
Or if it's built in, it already is. You can't like shift up. It's going to shift out or shift if you have a lot of welfare loss.
So if I go back here, Essentially what happens is instead of this term being a constraint, what the heck just happened? Hang on. Whoa. My screen went black. Oh, interesting. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. This is my oh. I picked it up and then it came back. All right. So the idea here is I will add a term into my objective function. So this might be something like yeah, so x k transaction. What the heck? Okay, very weird. Minus end use demand times welfare loss. Okay.
The welfare loss.
So what's happening here, right, is that you have a baseline of end use demand, and then this is trying to satisfy that. And so when they're matched up, it's this term becomes zero, and you have no welfare loss. Everyone gets the demand that they wanted. But now this is allowing me, instead of sort of perturbing, or instead of sort of meeting this exactly, I'm allowed to perturb the amount of end use demand that actually happens. So this becomes positive, right? Or sorry, I guess this would be negative if this was like lower than your end use demand, which would induce a cost to happen. And so you want to try and not have that happen as much as possible.
But if you constrain it, you can't do that. It can't be.
No, so you're saying that not you have this instead of this.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure.
Yeah. So the Markell model is a little bit more flexible in that it allows you to not quite meet end use demand. You just have a cost associated with that, and you would be willing to pay this cost, right? If the trade-off is that it's a lot more expensive, right, to do.
The welfare loss. Of the end use, or is it
something like that? It would be related to the elasticity. I don't know exactly how they would quantify that.
System be customer base wide, or would it be
yes?
It'd be customer base wide, but then it would be an adjusted one for high and low, right? So you'd have to do this. You'd have multiple.
Oh, sure, because it's like stepwise. Yeah, that's right. Yep. Yes.
So energy efficiency features in here, and the end use demand falls substantially below the transaction.
Oh yeah, yes. So energy efficiency. So think about this conceptually. End use demand would be the like service, not the actual like electricity or something. I know I was saying megawatts, but yeah, that would be problematic for efficiency. But you can think of like efficiency would get incorporated into this in a way that artifact doesn't happen.
You just like trans.
Yeah.
Then use demand would be like whatever
miles. Yeah.
So
so end use demand wouldn't be megawatts. You could think of end use demand as like lumens for lighting, and then I don't know, what else would there be? Like therms for heating. Yeah. So, right. And so then like the efficiency part is like captured upstream and yeah.
Wouldn't that add a separate function where the end use demand is determined by what's required to meet a given level of service? So X lumens or some levels of miles travel, because I don't see how the units would then match up. This transaction as the unit.
No, yeah. So right, it's like we're sketching on the go. So like this isn't gospel, right? Like
I didn't say though, it's like miles.
Yeah.
You say okay, your end use demand.
Yeah.
You say, so everyone needs to go 50 miles a day, 100 people, right? So 5,000 miles. 5,000 miles means you have to have this much power to do that. So then it's the end use demand in terms of megawatts or in terms of the energy.
And then the end use demand we determine externally that if you have to travel 5,000 passenger miles,
Yeah.
then that's how much end use demand you'll need.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Correct.
why.
Correct. Exactly. Okay. Good detour. Yep.
More of a curiosity in that model we came up with. Everyone stays home, right? No one needs during the pandemic, and no one needed to travel, so the end use demand went down low. So the welfare loss in the whole system was higher.
No, but like that, like the pandemic would be
an aberration.
Yeah, like this model is not built to really handle that type of thing.
Put that data in there.
Yeah.
Show there's a massive welfare loss on the system, right? Because it's not maybe on the electricity system, but like
on. Yeah. So I don't actually think you'd have I think you would want to change this exogenously, right? So the end use demand. So then, then this could fall a lot. Okay. So constraints, the most basic one, right, that we talked about. So satisfying energy service demands. And then there's a whole bunch of other details that you can imagine in like a complex system that we want to think about. So like capacity transfer is a kind of interesting constraint if you're dealing in multi-period problems. It's like basically how you deal with new capacity coming online and capacity retiring. Use of capacity. So we did talk about that one. That's basically saying like, oh, the amount of service that I can generate is limited by the amount of capacity available in the system, right? And so that kind of connects your operational side of things with your infrastructure and capacity side of things. Balance of commodities, so whatever you produce plus import has to be equal to what you consume plus export. Electricity and heat balance. So yeah, a number of other sort of details that might be specific to certain technologies or certain sectors. Emission constraints. One, actually, I didn't, the last one here, objective function that I didn't quite cover. So taxes and subsidies. So this is where you can integrate certain types of policies into the objective function. And then analogously, right, we talked about like if you had an emissions cap, like you could have a constraint there too, right? And so injecting policy decisions into or constraints into your model can come in the form of either introduction into your objective function or into the constraints of your model. Yeah.
In the previous slide, it has like mining costs, mining trade portion. Isn't that cost built into the per unit price of whatever fuel they have? So like barrel oil, right? Mining costs, mining are included in that. So you need to include that, or how
it just depends on the way that it's like scoped, so like something like
could be news or something.
well, no, so you have material imports that might have a cost, and that the cost from a material import might include the whole sort of upstream set of costs, right, associated with it. And then for like domestic fuel resources, you might have some costs associated with the production of that, right? And that might allow you to do things like look at like reserves and how costs might change, right?
You can flex the amount of like production. You can flex the amount of like production and then associated.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
So when you mentioned minimizing total cost, is it total levelized cost in some way of the system? Because I'm seeing that there's annual investment, then O&M.
Yeah.
So is it like
NPV? So they're doing a min of the NPV
of the whole system.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and then here, taxes and subsidies. Can anyone think of any recent policies that you might be able to test with something like this? Yeah, production tax credits out of IRA. I was thinking of IRA generically, right, which contains tons of subsidies and stuff like that. So you could include that into the system and see what happens, how your energy system build out changes in the future. Yeah.
EV rebates?
Yeah, EV rebates, exactly. So subsidies, again, would affect that. So your like investment costs or something might change. What's that? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, in IRA. Yeah. Still, they just came out. Yes.
Good stuff.
It's like 30% or something of the total cost. I know more about the car stuff, not so much about other pieces of IRA. Okay. And then the last sort of bit of the optimization, right? We covered the objective function and constraints, decision variables. So these are the ones that they talked about, and we can kind of analogously link these to the model that we kind of came up with on the fly, right? So INV, new capacity. They also have CAT for what's already installed.
Transaction maybe, basically, physical megawatt hours.
Yeah, exactly. So that's that. So they call it activity level. We were saying transaction, but conceptually, right, we can think of this as very similar. So they have mining, import, export, amount of trade that you're doing. So demand, right, is in this case a decision variable. So that's how you endogenize it. And then there's like costs associated with the demand based off of elasticities. Yeah. Actually, I don't know why emissions would be a decision variable.
Isn't it? Well, if there's a cap, if there's a tax, a cap. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sometimes this is a it's not a trick. But one thing that you can do to make the like formulation of an optimization easier sometimes is you can actually include parameters as decision variables and then constrain it later. And it makes sometimes it makes the like formulation like cleaner or easier to come up with, right? And so what I mean is that this might be something that you could calculate from like capacity and activity level, right? Based on a particular technology, there's an emissions associated with how much it gets used. But instead of like calculating that, you have that as a decision variable, and then there's a constraint later that kind of figures this out.
So you just pull it out.
Yeah.
For each technology.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that's what's going on here, but that's kind of what I suspect. In practice, it's not that big of a deal to do something like that unless you're trying to like streamline your optimization. If it's like really computationally complex, you want to sometimes like reduce the number of decision variables. But yeah, yes.
You are
Yes. Yeah. So there's probably a baseline demand, and then you have some kind of like welfare loss function associated with it in the objective. Yeah.
If you include functions absolutely W level, can you why wouldn't you be able to constrain it in this? Because it's you can only constrain the activity level, and because it's part of that, you can't constrain the variables in each decision variable.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Basically, you said it's easier to include some parameters as decision variables and you constrain later.
Yes.
Because it just makes it easier.
Sometimes the math is like easier to formulate.
Okay, so
yeah.
like if I have a given technology,
yeah.
So let's say it's coal, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to put my emissions in that variable too. I could, and that would produce the same thing as taking it out and keeping it separate.
Mm-hmm.
It would just make the model run slower, faster, or just makes the math look a little more complex.
Yes, I think the last thing, it usually makes the math look a little bit more complex.
Just aesthetics, quote unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it can be a lot more complex. And so I've worked with some models where we do things like this. But again, I'm not entirely sure that's the reason here. Okay, there's lots of different versions of Markell over the years. You can see linear, nonlinear versions, even mixed integer, and even stochastic programming. Actually, I've never seen this one before, but yeah. And then there are slight modifications that allow the model to look at, particular things or nuances that expand some of the features of the model. And so you can see how different people have kind of messed around with Markell over the years to look at specific things. Yeah, and so this was a very popular model in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And a lot of the stuff that they're talking about still kind of relevant today, right? And so this was end of the 90s. There was this was one of the global versions of Markell looking at mitigation strategies and what that could do in terms of global emissions. So this was their sort of baseline of what emissions look like. And then this blue line, the 2 degrees Celsius scenario that includes basically all of the types of traditional things like fuel switching, efficiency improvements, lots of renewable energy, lots of renewable power. That flattens us out, looks something like this. And then with land use, looks something like this. And then with carbon capture and sequestration, you can actually go negative in emissions, right? Yes. 29. Oh, I have no idea. People stopped. Huh? Yeah, people stopped caring about climate change again in in 70 years.
We started launching rockets to Mars.
Yeah, I mean, this could be some like population dynamics thing that could be happening. I honestly don't know. But yeah, like if you think about all the like climate modeling and everything, and like mitigation strategies that are happening, it's like honestly not really too different from what was kind of being described 20, 25 years ago. If you kind of dig a little bit deeper, looking at some of the outputs for like total primary energy consumption. So this is particularly in the EU. We can think about, where did these forecasts get it wrong, but then what sort of useful things came out of it. So what do you guys think in terms of discrepancies? So there's two scenarios here. There's a business as usual, and then there's like a CO2, trying to meet some kind of CO2 target scenario. So we could maybe just focus on the BAU. Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the really big ones. And in fact, if we look specifically at the electricity sector, so 2000, 2010, 2020, natural gas does go up a little bit, but that's actually mainly due to sort of proportional increase in demand, right? And then if you look at development of wind and solar and other renewables, so that's this plus that bit, increases a little bit, but not that much. Yeah.
So is this model saying that the fracking in the US exogenously increased gas supply to the EU?
No. It didn't know about fracking.
Oh.
This was like back in the 90s, right?
So if it did, it would have updated it to include that extra natural gas supply.
Yeah. So if I retrospectively like took this exact model and I just changed the inputs, one of the big things that I would probably change is like supply of natural gas, prices of natural gas.
2010.
Yeah.
Like huge.
So it is important to think about like some of these things, the capabilities of the model in thinking about the dynamics of the system under certain conditions, but like being able to predict like maybe what I would call a kind of revolutionary change in the oil and gas industry, harder to kind of predict and inject into the model. And in fact, you can see that here, right? So here, the size of gas is larger than predicted, and the other really big one is renewables. So this is 30%, right? And that does include the hydro. So actually this bit, maybe that is a little bit closer to this. So, some things they might actually get closer. Yeah.
So when we establish like a temporal spatial boundary around these models, do we not also limit that boundary when it comes to how much imports could play a role in these numbers? So let's say for the EU, temporal spatially, I'd imagine that during that time and even some years forward, they were primarily dependent on Russian natural gas. And so there was some coefficient to offset that sort of the US shale fracking boom and how much it could affect these models. So if you're looking at the EU, wouldn't the limitations or extend or draw a boundary around where this gas within the electricity production sector come from?
So okay. So I would yes, but you're describing a sort of nuance of how much detail to include in the system, right? And the takeaway here is that there are certain perturbations to our system that could happen that you wouldn't necessarily foresee coming, right? And so, yes, like you can get all detailed about certain things, but the whole point is that these types of models can often miss, these large scale shifts in your energy system or other, parts of the system. Yeah.
I'm noticing a kind of a trade-off oscillation between coal and natural gas here. Is that kind of a common feature of models like this, or doesn't feel like it's reflecting reality that you get sort of oscillations between two fuels like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know the exact details of what's going on here, but I could see that happening, right? So if you have two fuel sources that are sort of substitutes for each other and the prices are relatively close, models like these can have what's known as this knife edge behavior where you rapidly switch from one to the other, because as soon as it's more cost effective, it wants to do everything in the other direction, right? And so that may be related to what's happening here. Yeah.
Description of actual systems. What's that from?
Yes. Yes.
That effect you described, that is the model that assumes the pathways. Maybe I'm using this wrong. Pathways for use of that fuel or use of that technology exists because it's not defined otherwise. So natural gas, for example, we already have a pipeline that goes to homes, all that. We can increasing that, it's easy to the model because we already have that, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're going from fossil natural gas to heavily wind and solar, right?
You'd have to build new capacity.
You have to build new capacity, and you include that as a
yep. In that global model, places where it did really poorly in the transportation sector, if you kind of look across the suite of available vehicle technologies, you'll notice that it's missing electric vehicles just in general, right? And so, in this case, it may have done all right in the electricity sector, but even in the sort of aggressive carbon mitigation scenario, it's saying mainly you're going to get climate mitigation through hybrid vehicles, biofuels, and hydrogen vehicles.
You never gave synfuel hybrids chance they deserve.
Yeah, definitely. Synfuels, that's expensive.
Synfuel hybrids.
Toyota's dream. Yeah, right. So EV is not strongly considered due to sort of pessimism and costs and performance of the batteries. Right.
Do they anticipate a carbon price for this?
So some Markell models and publications have explored explicitly policies like carbon prices. So yeah, that's one of probably the more common scenarios that you would find. Yeah.
They say gas here is actually a gas rather than gasoline because it seems like they really underestimate the gasoline. It needs gasoline.
I think these two are basically just gasoline. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So Markell was the precursor to the Times model. It's actually a lot of people say Markell/Times. So Times built off of the framework of Markell, and we'll talk about some of the extra features that it had in a bit. So that was the Markell framework. Here's the Times framework. And if you look closely, you'll notice that they're the same. Yeah. Uh-huh. Here? Yeah. 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 So, they added some more words, but it's basically the same thing.
Colors.
And they switched the cut. Yeah. Some graphics designer person was like, I'm really gonna spruce this thing up. Okay. So the basic modeling paradigm is essentially the same. And it represents this dynamic partial equilibrium model of your energy markets. But there are a number of improvements in times. So flexibility in variable time period lengths. So Markell was really fixed. You could only really do like 5-year increments or something like that. But now you could do increments of 1 year, or you could even do increments as long as like 20 years, right? And so that flexibility lets you investigate different problems with a sort of much better fidelity. Some of these things are ease of use things, but actually might require substantial updates to the model, which is why I kind of include them here. Flexible time slices, this was a really big one. So now, over the period of year, I can focus specifically on like seasonal or monthly things. So I could do like 3 days in each season or 3 days in each month. I could do weekends versus weekdays, or I could do a full blown like daily across a full year, right? And this definitely required big updates to the structure of the model, but it's really useful because if you wanted to focus on elements related to like seasonal aspects of the outcomes, it lets you avoid diving into like a daily level of detail that might, make your model 10 times longer to run, something like that. Includes energy storage, uh, yeah, flexible processes, improvement in the way investment payments were happening. Markel would pay everything at the beginning of a defined time period, and now there are some more flexible options in how that happens. And then it endogenizes some of the effects of climate change that can feed back into the model as you go over some longer time periods.
Is this, like all these updates are reflective of new technology, improvement like energy storage, but also like a better understanding of like operations of like discrete elements of the energy system. So like, and also maybe.
Yeah, but I would describe that as not necessarily a like model change. Those are like input updates, right? Which would naturally happen anyway. So you're like Markel over the years are going to have more refined inputs, which is what you're going to get out of like your updated times as well.
But like the flexible time slices too, like that requires far more like computing power to do. Is this also like a result of, hey, we have power?
Oh yeah.
We should do this in Markel.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Probably. I mean, Moore's law, right? You're
like
improving, computing power continuously.
Like, only existed in Star Wars.
Sure. Yeah. One other really big thing is that the models became more widespread, more accessible, and you had lots and lots of different stakeholders basically be able to leverage and use this model. And so just to give a quick highlight reel, I kind of combed through the literature to see how many different times variants there are. So Canada has a version. This is a generic examination of their energy system. There's one for Pakistan. Switzerland has one.
Why is French?
Huh?
Just north of Brazil, French. It's just like if you look at all the other contracting parties.
Oh.
Like it doesn't, it's like which one doesn't fit in this picture?
French.
Is it,
It's France. French.
It's French.
Yeah, so contracting parties may be entities that that have direct contracts with IEA to support like model development. Yeah, I think it costs like 20,000 euros or something to be like, yeah.
I only need a double check. Oh, like
yeah. So Denmark has one. They were looking at focusing on residential use. Italy, looking at the overall energy system. There's one in the UK. Japan, China. There was a big study on building electrification in China using the times model. Not a country, but of course, California, we have our own time. So actually, when I came to Davis, I was primarily sort of hired to help out with the California Times model. So I have a love-hate relationship with the California Times model. Very complicated, but there's a lot of focus, looking at what the transportation sector is going to look like. There was a big push. Oh my God, that was almost a decade ago. To think about that knife edge behavior that I was talking about and how to increase the sort of complexity there. They actually put in a sort of state-of-the-art choice model in order to look at how transportation technologies would get adopted into the future. That was a big lift from a whole bunch of students and postdocs and researchers. So yeah, California, of course, has their own. And then, of course, there are versions of this worldwide. This is one study that I think was, focusing specifically on the future of nuclear power. Yeah, fusion. It's there. It's finally there. 2080. Yeah.
Mandates for certain kinds of vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, we had that in the California Times. If you had something like the ZEV requirements, then you could literally just put a constraint that's like, the equivalent of car capacity for the technology has to be a certain percent every year, right? And so we could enforce that explicitly as a constraint in times.
Evidence affect the overall amount of the different energy types is aggregated across the region.
Yeah. So it would basically force the model to select like electric vehicles, for example, because you had this policy constraint in there. Oh, yes. Yeah. So having that feedback lets you incorporate the effects of climate change. So one really simple example, just an example, is like it gets hotter, and so your air conditioning demand goes up, right? But obviously it's more complex than that, right? They have all the other sort of effects that are happening.
The model is built by behavior and evaluate the effect.
Yes. So it does sound an awful lot like a integrated assessment model, but again, it's not actually working through a formalized like climate model. It's doing approximate like at this CO2 ppm, there's like this degree change. And then that leads to some set of effects, as opposed to taking the emissions of GHG, putting it through a climate model, and then trying to observe the like effects and all the spatial effects and all that. It's way more simplified. I guess, the fact that it is endogenizing those climate effects technically makes it an integrated assessment model, but it's really not at the same type of level as something like the models that we were talking about from previous lecture, like GCAM or something. Yeah.
Last year, there were severe droughts in China that took out a lot of their hydropower.
Yeah.
With like lots of water.
Yeah.
And then they had to switch to other energy. So
that
this kind of model.
Yes, I was gonna say that type of thing. I would be surprised if that type of effect could get captured in the type of feedback that this is giving. Yeah.
Can we capture that kind of effect by plugging in a probability value next to the transaction term, C transaction, or let's say hydro? So if there are changes in climate patterns, maybe there's a number that tells you that due to these changes, the hydro transaction value is going to be this by this probability and this by another.
Well, okay, but yes, you could do that, but the point is that like you wouldn't have known to do that until you heard about China having these droughts last year, right? Like it's just like there are effects from climate change that are very hard to predict, and so they may get some really obvious ones, right? But they may miss certain things. Yeah, so for me, I kind of really wish that we could do like a hands-on demonstration of times, but it's like not really possible. It's too big and too complicated. So instead, we're kind of like walking through the features in this way. Huh?
To do a demo of Markell?
No, also too big. Well, you could, but it would be, it would probably take a couple lectures just like walk through all the nodes and like, right. There's I will actually post a link to, so there's a third model not connected. Speaking of not connected, called Message, and that is done by IASA. Oh, what does IASA stand for again? Does anyone know? It's another big international energy agency in Vienna. They're one of the big players in this arena. It's IIASA, I think, or it's IAASA. IIAS, yeah. Yeah, I know some folks who work there, and they do great work. So there is a toy version of the message model that you could play around with, and I was gonna do a tutorial on that, but it doesn't work on Macs. So I thought that would be less convenient for a lot of people. I see a couple of Macs around here. Okay. So yeah, Times has Markell, and then it's what's the opposite of a predecessor? It's like descendant. Times has developed. Yeah, its successor. Thank you. Its successor, Times, has evolved this like very strong modeling community. So if folks are interested in it, there's plenty of support to get into this type of thing. It's being used by a huge number of entities, as I just showed, and they hold workshops twice a year to help train and familiarize users with the model. Yeah, and so it is challenging. It is somewhat challenging to kind of get into, but there is support there available. And then, yeah, in terms of just in the US, California has its own version of the Times model, and then some regulatory agencies actually use Markell/Times. So EPA recently moved from Markell to Times, maybe like 20 years late, but that's okay. Okay, any questions about these models? Okay, well, that's all I have for today. So we're gonna end a little bit earlier. And I'll stick around a couple minutes in case anyone has any other questions. Yeah. Yes, so we are going to provide feedback hopefully by the end of the week.